Welcome, traveler. I'm glad you found the gallery. Not many people make it this far. Are you seated comfortably? Good. The midnight hour approaches. Tonight, you have the privilege of witnessing a private showcase displayed here for the first time. Each exhibit in the gallery is a collector's item in its own way, not because of any particular artistic quality, but because each captures a frozen moment of a nightmare. You can't look away now, can you? Don't try to leave. The doors are locked. The lights are off. The dark is all-consuming. Welcome to the Midnight Gallery.
Sarah blinked awkwardly, a solitary tear rolling down her cheek. The man in the white lab coat smiled and switched on the light. "I highly doubt you have glaucoma, but it's always good to check." He took a clipboard from a nearby pedestal and started making notes. Sarah nonchalantly raised her head from the tonometer and wiped the eye that had just taken a puff of air. Whilst the optician was busy, she slipped her glasses back on and mentally noted the first several letters from the eye chart. E, F, P, T, 0, Z, P, E, D. She recited this back to herself. In the grand scheme of things, she was only cheating herself by lying to the optician and memorizing the letters on the wall chart, but she hated to think he knew the true nature of her blindness. Sarah knew this notion was ridiculous. He was her optician after all. It was his job to ascertain the level of her short-sightedness. But she found him rather handsome, and who knew? Maybe, with a bit of flirting, there was a minuscule chance he wasn't married and didn't have a girlfriend. Halving the minuscule chance into 2 micro-minuscule chances, there was also the hope that they could get something to eat afterwards, have a few drinks, and then, well. The optician cleared his throat and smiled again. Sarah stirred from her fantasy and smiled back. She felt a flush of embarrassment ripple through her, almost as if he'd been reading her thoughts. "I'm just going to examine the retina at the back of your eye now. I'll be shining a light into your eye, so you may see a shadow afterwards in your vision, but this will soon fade, so don't worry." He dropped the clipboard back upon the pedestal and switched the main light off. Sarah held her breath as he inched closer to her and produced a small black object from his coat. She wasn't used to people being in her personal space. She could smell his aftershave and wondered if she should say something, maybe light-hearted, to break the uncomfortable silence. She quickly thought about what she had for lunch. She didn't remember having any garlic in the panini earlier. "You know," she whispered, "I bought some glow-in-the-dark contact lenses recently. That way, when I close my eyes, I can still see in the dark." The optician clicked the apparatus off. She couldn't gauge his reaction, as there was now a large purple blob pulsating and hovering in her field of vision. He wheeled back to his clipboard and with the hitch of his thumb turned the main lights on again. If he found the quip amusing, he wasn't showing it. "I just have to find your prescription and then I'll be right back," he said, getting up from the chair. She smiled and chided herself inwardly for saying something so childlike. After the door closed behind him, Sarah let out a tortured sigh. E, F, P, T, 0, Z, P, E, D. She closed her eyes and repeated the letters again aloud in a rhythmic mantra, as if by hearing them audibly, they would soothe the social inadequacy she felt. She heard her mother's flat, staccato voice in her head. "Always the bridesmaid, never the bride." A failed marriage of 5 years and a few damp squib Tinder dates in the past couple of months. She would have laughed if she didn't think her life was so tragic. Veering close to 35, Sarah could already feel the biological clock ticking towards an unfathomable apex, a pinnacle of empty wine bottles and weeping randomly at dog-shit rom-coms. Where had it all gone wrong? When she opened her eyes again, two things became apparent to her. Firstly, the floating purple blob was gone from her vision, and secondly, an eyeball was staring at her from the wall. At first, she thought the eyeball was a small, crude drawing pinned to the wooden panelling, or that a child had placed a googly eye sticker next to the wall chart. She likened to think that the optician was good with children, and perhaps even handed out lollipops to them after an eye exam. When she saw the eyeball blink, however, she knew that it was real and someone was watching her from behind the walls. A fragment of a memory clawed through her fugue-like state, an old horror movie, one where a couple were passing a staircase of a creepy mansion. She remembered the large oil painting, a viscount or some lord of the manor. As the couple walked past, the eyes followed them, a peephole. Someone was looking at her through a peephole. She didn't freak out, which surprised her. After a moment, it seemed like everything around the eye came vividly into focus. The imperceptible flickering fluorescent light of the wall chart, the scuff marks of the shoes on the skirting board, the fraying edges of leather on the chair in front of her. She also realised a few peculiarities about the office itself. The timber-panelled walls seemed weird in a modern optician. The hole in the wall was about 3 inches in diameter each way, and scrutinising it closely, Sarah was surprised that she hadn't noticed it earlier. She stood up, curious now. She took a few tentative steps forward, and before she could come any closer, the eye blinked again. She stopped. "Hello?" The eye stared at her. She felt unnerved. The initial decision of standing up and speaking to the eye shriveled within itself, and it seemed redundant, stupid. Didn't that horror movie end with the couple being chopped into little bits? Her internal monologue was screaming to leave the room, to leave this place, immediately. She conducted a half-turn when a single germ of a thought crept into her mind, manacling itself firmly like a tick, some deep-rooted foreboding thought that kept her still. The eye was locked on her like a military-style weapon. She was the target, painted in its sight. She felt an acute clarity that if she left this room, she would die. The door opened. The optician was half muttering to himself, his head down, looking at her results, when an ethereal notion made him look up to see Sarah's confused and frightened expression. There was a thin, rasping sound that came from behind the walls. The voice was hoarse, as if the owner was chewing on a dozen marbles. The optician lowered the clipboard. His eyes darted from Sarah to the hole in the wall. "Please tell me you heard that," Sarah squeaked. The optician quickly closed the door behind him. He dropped the clipboard on the pedestal and stood silent for a moment. He ran a hand through his hair. "You've met Horace, I see," he said as a way of explanation. Sarah blinked several times in rapid succession. "Horace?" shrieked the voice from behind the wall. Sarah jumped, looking at the solitary eye. It blinked again and then vanished. There was a dark chasm now in its place, and Sarah didn't know whether this was better or not. The optician shook his head and put his hands on Sarah's shoulders. "Just remember, do whatever Horace asks. It's best not to upset him." Sarah stood numb. Her mouth opened to ask a question, but in her peripheral vision she could see something coming out of the hole. A dirty, thick finger poked out, wagging in earnest. The optician bowed his head. "Can we do this later, Horace?" he asked, with a notable tremor in his voice. There was a high-pitched scream from behind the wall. Sarah likened it to a wounded animal. After the shriek abruptly ended, there was a moment of sobbing. Sarah tried to move, but the optician held her firmly in place. The sobbing was incessant, but after a moment, Sarah noticed a change. The sobbing turned into laughter. She felt the optician's grip tighten on her shoulders. Sweat dried cold upon her brow, while her innards writhed like warm serpents. The once handsome optician now looked like he'd aged a millennium. She could see that tears were brimming and about to pool over from his eyes. "Remember what I told you, okay?" he said, before releasing his grasp and walking toward the hole in the wall. Walking, Sarah thought, with all the intensity of someone moving and being deafened by the continuous scream of a fire alarm. He removed his coat and carefully placed it on a nearby table. He sighed inwardly, as though motivating himself to complete an arduous chore. Horace's stubby digit waggled furiously from the peephole. A noxious odour permeated the small office, and Sarah recoiled as she detected the stench of excrement. She knew exactly where the source was. Now that she focused on Horace's finger, she spotted what looked like coagulated fudge, the colour of black pudding, coating his appendage. Gingerly, the optician motioned his head towards the hole. Sarah felt like she had stumbled into something private, a moment that she had no right to witness. She wanted to look away, her brain already concluding what was about to happen, but she couldn't tear herself away from the spectacle unfolding before her. The optician opened his mouth slowly and enclosed it around the dirty, stumpy finger. He made small, gagging noises as Horace probed around inside the optician's mouth. From behind the wall, Sarah could make out sounds of cooing. The optician had his eyes closed and palms against the wall, as if he were trying to think of a happy place, somewhere far away from the cramped office they were currently imprisoned. Sarah thought about pinching herself to make sure she wasn't dreaming. Horace's clucking started to rise and level, as if he was filled with giddiness. Sarah did finally look away, when she saw the contours of the optician's cheeks billow and undulate as the finger explored around inside. There were strange, suckling noises, and then she heard the optician retch as Horace pulled his finger away. "Very good, Horace," the optician croaked. He put his coat back on. When Sarah looked at the hole, the eye was back, focused on her. The optician sighed again. Resignedly, he motioned for Sarah. "He wants you to lick his eye." Sarah nodded, as if all of this made sense. "I think I'd like to leave now," she whispered. The optician went to his clipboard and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, as if a sour aftertaste lingered on his tongue. "We haven't finished your examination yet," he said. Sarah nodded again, and then made for the door. Horace wailed. His voice was high and thin as a reed. Sarah turned the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. "He likes you," the optician said. "He's not going to let you leave yet." Sarah's throat convulsed, but no sound emerged. She didn't realize she was flailing her arms against the door in a pitiful attempt to escape until the optician courteously guided her away. Sarah sucked in air, coughing and choking, each breath slicing through her raw throat like inhaling shredded glass. What is going on?" she said, more to herself than anyone else. "If it's any consolation, I like you too," the optician said. He smiled, and Sarah saw a streak of brownish substance at the corners of his mouth. Sarah felt dizzy, as if the walls were starting to close in on her. She sat down. "Always the bridesmaid, never the bride." Sarah found it peculiar that her mother would be saying this at such a time, but it was just another tick in the box to add to her woeful experiences lately. Horace excitedly suggested. The optician nodded, as if he was considering something. "Once you've licked his eye, Horace would like to meet you in person. You're one of the lucky ones." He doesn't normally want to meet guests. Sarah started giggling. It was through sheer nerves. I know it's a lot to take in, the optician said as he beamed a great wide smile, but honestly, it's for your own good. Sarah's giggling turned to a manic laughter as the optician guided her to the wall, towards Horace and the bulging eye from the peephole. I try to think that I'm licking a watermelon, the optician offered. She could smell his sweat and feel the rise and fall of his chest. Sarah's laughter had transcended into a frenzied wailing as she drifted nearer to the wall. She raised her eyes and looked. What she saw struck her mute with horror. The wall panel had somehow moved without her realizing it. It reminded her of the horror film with the young couple trying to escape the mansion, secret passages, demons in the attic, or in the optician's wall. An unearthly hand, covered in dirt and grime and God knows what else, shot out from the darkness and clamped over Sarah's clenched fist. The pain was immediate, fiery and immense. She felt her fingers break as Horace squeezed tight, pulling her into the dark space of the optician's office. The last thing she saw before her glasses fell off was her crumpled hand, her fingers, a crazy road sign, pointing in all directions at once. She didn't have time to scream or anything else. She was pulled into the void, and the wall panel swiftly slid back into place. The optician turned to the wall. He leant up against it, a metallic and filthy taste in his mouth. Jeanette squinted at the spidery handwriting on the small piece of paper haphazardly stuffed on the grabber. It was early and the machines hadn't warmed yet, so she pondered this chance to rest a moment longer, to drink in the aroma of the cafe. The Blue Moon had a funky 50s vibe to the place. Red tiled walls, chrome cased stools for the long bar, thin tubes of red and blue neon buzzing imperceptibly in the background. Jeanette and Pauline were the morning waitresses for the day. The morning shifts were the best for her, as she could drop off Cody to the play school and then hop on the bus straight to work. She had tired eyes and she rubbed them with her knuckles. She didn't much care for the late shifts. Groups of teenagers usually descended upon the cafe at that point. The type of teenagers that wore jeans hanging off their hip bones so the brand name of their underwear showed. No, she preferred the morning shifts. The handwriting on the tab was blurred. Great, she thought sourly. Another fucking thing to add to the list. The creep owes 3 months child support, I'm behind on the gas and electric, and to top it all off, I'm going blind. Jeanette sighed heavily, the air leaving her body, taking with it all her strength. Christmas was a few months away too, so she'd have to work double shifts just to stay above the water. They should have already upgraded to POS systems, but Teddy was a stickler for the old way of things. Said that it added to the ambience of the place. The ambience, she scoffed, with cobwebs hanging in the corner ceilings and a jukebox in the corner with the coin slot plugged with gum or something worse. Yeah, Teddy, that's some 5-star quality ambience right there. We're a real authentic greasy spoon. The owner didn't really come in anymore, his advancing years taking their toll, but Jeanette didn't really care so much. He'd usually ramble and rant about something politically incorrect and help himself to coffee all day, so his absence made her feel a little less spied on. Pauline glanced over. "You look how I feel, love," she said. Her voice was husky and splintered, something that Jeanette always associated with whiskey and cigarettes. Jeanette shrugged. "Well, Jay, don't say I never do anything for you, huh?" Jeanette's brow creased in confusion. Pauline tilted her head subtly and her eyes darted to booth 3 by the window. Jeanette smiled. Maybe today wouldn't be so bad after all. Jeanette brought the full English breakfast to the handsome man in the booth. He seemed to have a kind face, accentuated with rounded glasses and dimples that would send even Jeanette's mother weak at the knees. He acknowledged her with a smile, and she wondered if he was married or had a girlfriend. He always visited the Blue Moon in the morning, ordered the same fry-up with black coffee. She and Pauline had a running bet as to what he did. Jeanette had £50 in the pool that he was a doctor. He had long, slender fingers. Although they never really spoke apart from morning pleasantries, she wondered if he came in here for other reasons than breakfast. She noticed he was reading a newspaper and scrutinising an article. "I heard about that," Jeanette said, squinting at the picture in the paper. "Terrible stuff." The man nodded his head. "Poor girl. You think they'll find her?" The man gravely shook his head. "It's unlikely in these types of situations nowadays, isn't it?" He looked up at her then and seemed to study her. "Say, are you having problems with your eyesight?" Jeanette awkwardly laughed as she placed the plate down on the table. "I get by okay." The man seemed to consider this before he fished a card out of his pocket. He offered it to her, and Jeanette found herself smirking like a teenager that had just been asked out to prom. "You're an optician? You sound surprised." Jeanette slipped the card in her blouse pocket. "Well, bang, there goes my £50, she thought ruefully. "But Pauline doesn't need to know that. No sir, not like I have a spare £50 lying around at any rate. Not at all surprised. Truth be told, we have a running pool going on here regarding you." The optician arched his eyebrows. I mean, what I mean is, you're in here every morning. You order the same thing, read the same paper, have the same coffee. Got some of us girls thinking what it is you do." "Jeanette Pearson, are you flirting with this man? You girls talk about me, huh?" "Only sometimes." The optician stared at her for a moment. There was a flicker of something in those eyes. Jeanette couldn't tell exactly what, but it was there and then gone in an instant. "Does anyone else talk about me here?" Jeanette gave him a puzzled look. "Does anyone else ask after me?" "No, hun, no." There was something about these questions Jeanette didn't quite like, but then the optician smiled and she told herself she was being stupid. "Can I get you anything else, love?" she said, flashing her best smile at the handsome optician. He said no and returned to his paper. The waitress went about her morning chores and forgot about the conversation an hour later. But that evening, when she got home, when she picked up Cody from the play school and was changing into her home clothes, she looked at the card that the optician had given her. Maybe she would book an appointment to see him later that week. Get her eyes tested. Yes, that seemed like a good plan.